Let's get into some poker. All right. This is the next section in the tournament masterclass. Intro to the flop. Maybe we can get through this one today.
First, we're going to be discussing betting versus checking. All right. When you are first to act, or when it checks you on the flop, you have 4 possible decision pairs that you can make. You can bet and then continue if you get raised. And you're going to be doing that with your premium made hands. We're going to be discussing what a premium made hand is in just a second. But we are betting, we are putting money in the pot, and then we are continuing if we get raised. So if we have a very strong hand, like a set, 3 of a kind, or a straight, we're betting that hand, we're trying to get money in the pot, and if our opponent raises us, we're not folding. Okay? Next, we can bet and then continue, or bet and then fold with our draws. So we're betting, and then we're going to decide what to do based on the strength of our draw. Because draws come in various strengths, from straight draws with a flush draw with 2 overcards, which has a load of outs, all the way down to like an overcard and a backdoor flush draw, which has basically no outs or relatively few outs. So if you have a premium draw, you're betting it and you're not folding it. And if you have a weak draw, you're betting it and you're folding it if you get raised. So that's what we are betting with for the most part. And next, we have our checking range. We are checking and then calling if our opponent bets with our marginal made hands. So we're checking and then calling. This is going to be something like if we have a marginal pair, like middle pair, we're going to check. If our opponent bets, we're going to call. And then we're checking and then folding with our absolute junk. And so these 4 hand types are generally going to inform the decisions that you can make. So these 4 hand types are a method to roughly categorize your hands, your specific hands that you can have in your range, into various levels of strength to inform if you should be betting them or checking them. So, for example, you could have a premium made hand that we are betting and then continuing with. This is usually going to be something like a strong top pair or better made hand. So take a second, ask yourself, what is a premium made hand on Queen 9-7, 2 hearts? Well, logically, a hand like top pair with a good kicker, or 2 pair, or an overpair, or 3 of a kind. Those are going to be your premium hands that you are trying to bet and then not fold because they are so good. All right, your draws can, like I said, range in strength from flush draws to straight draws to backdoor draws. So, like I said, this category is going to fluctuate a lot depending on the board composition and or your range composition and the board's texture. So, like on this board, Queen 9-7, there's clearly a lot of draws available. But on a board like Ace 7-3, the only draws available are weak gut shot straight draws, right? So you have to be looking for draws in that scenario, whereas here the draws are going to be pretty obvious. You're going to find that the weakest draws on draw heavy boards that have a lot of draws possible, like this one, usually are just not very good. Like right here, if we had, let's say, 6-4 of diamonds for a backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw that's quite weak, that's just not a good hand. That's just total junk. But if you have a hand like, King 10 of diamonds, that actually becomes a reasonable draw because the king is an overcard, the backdoor straight draw is a little bit better, and the backdoor flush draw is better. So 6-4 of diamonds in this scenario is just very bad. King 10 of diamonds is a hand that you can bet, and if you get raised, you can probably just fold it. And then you also have your good draws like 10-8, Jack 10, also flush draws. Those are going to be draws that you are happy betting and then not folding if you get raised. Next, we're going to have marginal made hands. These are usually weak top pairs down to ace high type hands. These are hands that you are checking with the intention of calling if you face a bet. Now, I want to make it clear, the ace highs that you're going to check and then call with are going to be the good ace highs on boards like this that are very coordinated. If the board was less coordinated, then you can continue with more of the ace highs. Like right here, ace 3 of spades is just very bad, right? Whereas ace king of diamonds is pretty good. And we're calling ace high a marginal made hand because realistically, if it does check down, like you check the flop with ace king, you check the turn, you check the river, if you don't improve, you can still win at the showdown, right? Whereas with weaker hands, like let's say king high,
That's really the defining factor for me about marginal made hands is that if I don't bet, will somebody else bet? And if somebody else bets, am I likely to have a good bluff catcher? So when you think of things in that context, that can kind of tell you how many streets you can get for value. Like, boards like this where you opened, in a later position and the big blind defended, and, you bet the flop with like queen jack, with maybe the jack of hearts in your hand. And, if you were just to lead right at that and get action, it's not that great for you. So those are the ones where I'll try to keep my opponent's range very wide. So if they check to me, I can go ahead and just check and just delay the c bet and just say, you know what, I can get 2 streets out of this if my opponent doesn't think I have a queen. And if the turn comes off safe like a deuce of clubs, then I can go ahead and bet. And usually, believe it or not, betting larger there, like, a standard turn bet, with no flop bet, you're looking at 2/3 pot, maybe a little bit more. Be surprised how often people will call you with a 7 or a 9 or something like that, just wanting to see you bet twice. And then when the river comes off safe, one of my favorite plays is making a big bet or even over betting the pot. And it's amazing to me how many times I've gotten to the river in that scenario, and because betting something reasonable like 2/3 or 3/4, the opponent kind of has to have something decent to call you. But when you bet 1.5 to 2 times the pot, it's so ludicrous a bet that you will find people need less to call you in their own mind because they think, oh, this is ridiculous, this is bullshit now. And the truth is they have to be less successful percentage wise, meaning they can make that call a lower percentage of the time because the payoff of the pot is so big. Now we're talking about tournament poker where that should not be a factor as much as it is in cash games, but I find it works the same in both. And then you just turn over the queen jack, and I remember a hand live where this happened, and I think it was king queen, or no, king jack, and I had made the jack on the flop, and I played the hand exactly that way, and on the river bet 2x pot, and this was a cash game. And the guy literally looked at me, and he called me an idiot, and then called the bet, and I said, well, I'm an idiot with a jack. And I just showed him the jack, and he was like, that's good enough, can I see the other card? And I go, sure. And I showed him the king, and he was like, what the fuck? And he just called me with like third pair. So that's where you can create that dynamic. Deciding that you only have 2 streets where 2 bets can be called doesn't mean you're going to win less money. Sometimes just means you have to get creative. Just a side thought on this.
You probably aren't going to win the showdown because your opponent's going to have ace high or something like that. So anyway, with these top pairs, you are checking, looking to check call. So a hand like king 9 is a very clear middle pair, good kicker. We're checking and then we're calling if our opponent bets. And then our junk is just going to be no backdoor draw, really. No good backdoor draw, at least. No straight draw, no pair, none of that. So a hand like jack 6 of clubs, 5-4 spades, really like ace 3 of spades, king 3 of spades, those are all going to be junk in this scenario, and we're just checking and giving these up. Now, one thing worth noting here. Notice that our premium made hands, we're betting, right? And we're also betting our draws. So when we're betting and we're applying aggression, our opponent doesn't really know if we have a premium made hand or a draw. So they don't know if we have a good hand or a bluff, like a semi-bluff, right? Semi-bluff is a bluff that has some outs to improve to a better hand. And that puts them in a tough guessing game when we're betting. Notice when we're checking, if we're checking our weak top pairs all the way down to like ace high that we're check calling, and then also some garbage, our opponents don't know if we plan on calling or folding when we bet. And that's going to result in them not being able to just mindlessly bluff us. What a lot of people do wrong is that they have a checking range that is far too weak. So when they're checking, it's usually just with a lot of junk. And when they're betting, it's usually with their decently strong hands, but not nearly enough draws. So that makes their betting range very strong, which means their opponents can just get out of the way and fold. And their checking range is very weak, which means all their opponents have to do to crush them is just bet. And you want to make sure that you do not do that because those players are very, very easy to play against. All right, so on this flop, let's categorize the following hands. Flop is king of clubs, jack of hearts, 4 of spades, and take a second and categorize these hands. We have ace king, 9-8 of hearts, pocket tens, queen 9 of spades, and jack 9 of diamonds. Pause the video. Go ahead. Categorize.
I'm going to go ahead and say good made hand, pretty much junk, 10-10 marginal made hand, queen 9, spades. Kind of a marginal draw, and the Jack Nine of Diamonds would be I'm going to call it a marginal made hand, but I think it's more in the era of a bluff catcher. So I guess that's kind of the same thing. So I think we're probably betting with the ace king. We're checking with the or betting and continuing with the ace king. With the 9-8, we're just going to check fold. With the 10-10, we're probably going to bet if we had the lead pre-flop, but probably going to check call if we didn't, depending on the situation in tournament. I'll say it's more likely a check call. The Queen 9 is most likely a check. I guess it could be a check call, yeah, or it could even be a bet, like a semi-bluffy kind of thing. Hey, Cosero, how you doing, my man? And then the Jack 9, I think, is another one for the... We could bet it, but I think it's better off to just check and continue.
Prize them into premium made hands, draws, marginal made hands, or junk. I'll wait on you.
The 10-10, actually, now that I think about it, without knowing who the raiser was and what my position is, I think most of the time the 10-10 is a check fold or a fold to a bet, depending on our position. It's kind of close. It depends. I mean, like all things, this depends, but we're just talking about the flop, and I'm guessing it's that we're first to act. So, bet, check, check, bet, check.
All right, you got it? You committed to it? Okay. Ace King is a premium made hand here. Top pair, top kicker is great. We are trying to get money in the pot. 9-8 of hearts. You may think that this counts as a draw, given it is a backdoor flush draw with a backdoor straight draw, but it's not very good.
It's more of a double backdoor, because if we had the 10-8 of hearts, that would even upgrade this hand a lot, because there is a specific card that we need to improve. Like getting a 7 on the turn doesn't really improve us because we're still on a gut shot. If we had the 10-8 and, you know, a queen or a 9 or a 7 comes off, you know, then we're picking up significant outs. So for me, that's trash.
If you do make a straight when it comes queen 10, you still lose.
Yep.
Also, if you get a pair, it's not particularly good. If you get a backdoor flush, I mean, yeah, that's pretty good, but it's not going to happen all that often. So this is not a good draw. This is just junk. You're happy to check it and then fold. Pocket tens is a marginal made hand. You're going to find that on the flop, basically all pairs, for the most part, maybe not all pairs, the majority of pairs are either premium made hands or they're marginal made hands. You are not checking the flop, planning on folding a hand like pocket tens if your opponent bets. The plan is to check call the flop with pocket tens, and then actually fold it if your opponent bets the turn. And you may say, well, why would I check call the flop but then fold the turn? Should I just fold immediately? And it turns out, no, you shouldn't. You need to make sure that you are calling your opponent's flop bets a decent amount of the time, because if you just check fold hands like tens, all your opponent has to do is just be a little bit aggressive and they're going to run you over. And you have to realize your opponent is not always going to keep betting the turn whenever you check call the flop, so your pocket tens wins very often when you check it down. Sometimes you get lucky and get a 10 on the turn and you win a bunch of money. And also when you're checking the flop and check calling, you're doing this not just with a hand like pocket tens, but also with a hand like king 9 suited, that you know you're not folding to any normal turn and river, right? So your opponent can't just run you over by betting the flop and the turn and the river, because you are going to be sure your checking range is well protected. And I'm going to show you how to do that throughout this course.
It's been started to have been known, I guess, about 2015, 2016, somewhere in there, that people needed to start calling flop bets more. Because, and I'll tell you, back in 2005, 2006, if you were one of the few of us who, especially in live poker, could bet every time you had raised pre-flop, you just printed equity because people just overfolded too much. And then over time, I mean, it took a good decade, and it was mostly, I think, due to poker being on TV and, you know, high-level players realizing how far ahead their hands really were, showing that you could call now. And this is why, until you get into like the $100 buy-in tournament levels, you can pretty much assume that your opponents are always going to call your flop bet, and most of the time at the $100 or lower level, they're not going to be expecting that turn bet every percentage of the time. Now, I don't bet the flop as much as I bet the turn. So I will mix in more flop checks, especially with the lead, than I will turn checks after I've been called. After I've been called on the flop, if the texture's still good and I feel like my opponent's still weak, I'm probably committing to betting 3 times and trying to shove him off the pot if I have nothing. It's just worked out so much better for me than playing this stupid guessing game. Like, it's better just to make the other guy guess. Oh, and a side note, marginal made hands are usually hands that can't improve much but do have good showdown value. Second pair, top pair, bad kicker, under pair that still has some strength. Because, if this guy bets the flop and he has like ace queen or something like that, or even, jack, queen, or, king 10, you know what I'm saying? It's not like they're always going to bet the turn. Then you can always turn the tables, make your hand into a bluff. Like you said, you can hit a 10. A queen's also good for you. So interesting ways you can play it if you don't fold too quickly.
Queen 9 suited, Queen 9 of spades. This is definitely a draw. This is a hand that if you check and your opponent bets, you probably have to fold it. But if you bet it and your opponent folds, that's clearly great. If you bet and you get the 10 on the turn, that's obviously great too. So this is a very clear draw. And Jack 9 of diamonds is a very, very clear marginal made hand, middle pair, bad kicker. This is a hand that if you check and your opponent bets, you're very happy calling on the flop, you're pretty happy calling on the turn, and you'll probably end up folding it out on the river if you fail to improve. But remember, you also have some weaker kings in your range that will also not fold. And remember, whenever you do check call with a hand like Jack 9, sometimes you get there on the turn and you make 2 pair or you make 3 of a kind and you're very happy. It's important to realize that the hand types are relative and are going to be highly dependent on the various flop texture, also dependent on your entire range composition. And this is going to be very clear with the draws. Sometimes draws are going to be very, very strong, like mostly good, strong flush draws that you're happy betting and getting money in, whereas other times your draws are going to be very junky, and we'll explain that as we continue going through this course. Okay, general rules for betting. When you are betting, you want to have 1 premium hand to 2 draws, which are going to be your bluffs. So you have 1 value hand to 2 bluffs.
The easiest way to remember this is the ace-king example is going to float into a lot of these things if you can categorize them in your mind. When you raise pre-flop with ace-king and get called heads up, about a third of the time you're going to hit an ace or a king. That's just the way it is on the flop. Those are the numbers. So you can see having a premium hand where you make that top pair versus the draws, the bluff ratio, you are still drawing to the overpair, but at the same time, just thinking about how often you make a pair with an unpaired hand on the flop, 1 for premium, 2 for draws and bluffs. And this is like minimum defense frequency kind of in reverse, meaning that you're defending your equity and your position, not exactly your hand.
When you are betting the flop, with the 2 number being the most bluffs you can have. So it's fine to have a 1 to 1.5 ratio or a 1 to 1 ratio, but you can have up to 2 draws to every 1 premium made hand on the flop. And that's because some of your draws are going to improve on the turn to be made hands, right? And also you're not going to continue bluffing with all of your draws on every single turn. So it's okay to be bluffing more than a 1 to 1 ratio. So you're going to find that you can have 33% premium made hands when you're betting to 67% draws at most. Again, if it's like 50-50 or 40-60, that's okay too. And your checking range.
This is the kind of thing where having your own HUD stats showing you what you're doing at the time can help you adjust. And it's as simple as checking out your own HUD stats on your flop bets, your C bets, and seeing that if they're getting too low or they're getting too high, you can adjust in game. And eventually, after you do that over hundreds and hundreds of tournaments, you won't have to look at the HUD. You'll just have a feeling inside per game what you're doing, and your basic general ratio will be corrected.
You want your marginal hands to be about 70% of your checking range and your junk to be about 30% of your checking range. And it's fine to have fewer or a smaller combination of junk. So you want to make sure that the weaker side of your range, the draws and the junk, is this number or less. So say it's like 80-20, it's fine. But you don't want to have 60% marginal made hands and 40% junk, because then what's going to happen is if you check and your opponent bets, you're just folding way too often. Also, when you're out of position, you're going to find that your premium hands generally get a little bit weaker, which result in you having to check with essentially a stronger range, right? So when you're betting, you want to be betting even less often when you're out of position. And that further helps to protect your checking range. If you check with some of your strong hands when you're out of position, you become just substantially more difficult to play against. And you can use the range analyzer, which I'll be explaining in just a second, to determine how to categorize your hands. Here is a visual breakdown of what I just explained. This is the hand types flowchart that will help you make your decision of when to bet and when to check. So as you see here, when we're betting, we have 33% premium made hands that we're going to continue with if we get raised. Then we have 67% draws, which we're going to figure out what to do when we get raised based on our pot odds, based on our opponent's raise size, etc., based on our hand strength, right? And then our marginal made hands we're checking, and then we're check calling, checking and continuing with the marginal hands, and we're checking and folding with the junk. So notice, so far we've only been discussing when you should bet and when you should check. We have not discussed bet sizing at all, which is a very important part of no limit hold'em. It's not one bet size only hold'em. So we're going to get to that very soon, so be patient. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to categorize all the hands in a particular range using the range analyzer, and we are going to see what our range looks like. We're just going to naturally break these down. We're not going to try to get too fancy initially. Okay, everyone folds to you under the gun +2, and you raise to 2.5 big blinds, and it folds around to the big blind who calls. The flop comes 9, 7, 5, diamond spade club, or diamond club spade. Categorize the following hands, and then we're going to put the range analyzer here to look at how we would play our entire range. So take a second and ask yourself, what does pocket jacks seem to be on this board? It's decent overpair. Decent overpairs are usually premium made hands. What about ace 10? Well, ace 10 has 2 overcards, but it also has some showdown value with that ace high. So this is probably a hand that you can reasonably check and then call. So this is going to be a marginal made hand. Ace 3 of spades. Backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw. 1 overcard. It'd be bad kicker, though, if we did get the ace. This is going to be somewhere between a draw and junk, and it's probably just going to be on the junky end. This is not a particularly great draw, especially on a board that has a whole lot of other draws available, right? Like notice any 8 is a draw, any 6 is a draw, any like decent 2 overcard hand with backdoor draws is better than this hand to some extent because it just is going to make overpairs or pairs bigger than top pair on the flop better more often. So this is not a particularly...
Side note, when he's saying any 8 is a draw, any 6 is a draw, you have to understand that's where the game has evolved to. People used to say, I have a draw on this board, this 9-7-5, and they would have to have something like 4-6 or 8-10. And the truth of the matter is, if you have an 8, you essentially have the same draw. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can get a 6, you can get runners, that make the straight. You can get a jack, you can get, whatever. If you have a 6, you can pick up a 4 or an 8. We've gotten to the point where now we understand that it's not so much having 2 cards in your hand for a draw as having 1 card in your hand for a draw is so strong because of the fact a lot of players can't see it. You know what I'm saying? Now, granted, you make a one-liner, but a lot of players are going to price you in quite often on those draws. And if you're especially in position, it allows you to take pots away later because of your equity. So just be aware of that. Used to be if somebody said it came out 9-7-5, I had a draw, you'd literally ask them, oh, do you have 4-6 or do you have 8-10? And, like people didn't even consider the fact that it was like, Jack 8 or, ace 6, with the suited in one of these suits. And it's really interesting how far the game has come as we get closer and closer to solving No Limit Hold'em. But even the top guys say it'll never be solved because of things like bet sizing, player tendency, and overall understanding of ranges. There's premium poker sites out there, and I like Jonathan Little's the best. But you have to understand what charts he's basing it on. He's using Munker Solver, and he's using, a very high level of playable ranges. There are some sites, I think Doug Polk's site uses a very different, it doesn't look very different to people who haven't seen it, but it's a pretty different range just opening pre-flop with certain bet sizes. His don't change as much as Jonathan Little's do. It's not quite as detailed, but he throws away the edges because his moves are so broad, which works GTO, and that's what, Doug Polk is trying to be. It's much easier to play GTO when you're heads up. So, it kind of makes sense. He's a heads up kind of specialist. Probably the best heads up player that ever was, honestly. So his charts are kind of skewed in that way. So because of things like this, we can't definitively say everybody's using these charts, everybody's using these ranges, everybody's doing all this. Whereas in limit hold'em, you can absolutely say that. There's just not as much play because the bet sizing is fixed.
Really good draw. This is usually going to be junk. Ace Jack of diamonds. So 2 overcards, backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw. This is a substantially better hand than Ace 3 suited, Ace 3 of spades. This certainly could fall somewhere between a marginal made hand and a draw. And we'll take a look at how that would line up in the range analyzer, but it's probably going to end up being a draw. Queen 10 of hearts, this is definitely a draw. Actually, I'm sorry, Queen 10 of hearts is not a draw because notice it doesn't have the backdoor flush draw. Backdoor flush draw actually does matter. You may think backdoor flush draw never comes in, does it? Well, turns out it does every once in a while. It's not just that it lets you win the pot when you get there, but you also get to keep betting very reasonably on the turn when you turn a flush draw, which lets you realize your equity better unless you pick up the pot sometimes when it doesn't belong to you, right? Okay. If it was Queen 10 of... Queen 10? Oh, we changed it here. If it was Queen 10 of diamonds or something like that, then we would be more inclined to call it a draw. Okay, so look, notice what we've done here. Let's take this slow. If you've never seen this before, I realize it can be overwhelming. You'll get used to it by the end of this course, though. Don't worry. Let's take a look at all the hands in red. These are our premium made hands, okay? Premium made hands are betting. These are our overpairs, top pair, top kicker, and sets. Good, strong hands that we are happy betting and not folding on this board, right? What are our marginal made hands? Let's do those next. These are going to be hands like top pair okay kicker down to hands like ace high. Notice here we have king 9 down to 9-8. We have some 7s. We have some 5s. Only not very many 5s, clearly, just ace 5 suited. Then we have some ace highs. Ace king down to ace 10. Now, what about our draws? This is where it gets a little bit difficult to very clearly define, but we'll start with the logical ones. Any hand with an 8 or a 6 that does not have showdown value with an ace or a pair pretty much counts as a draw, right? So we have king 8, jack 8, 10 8. Notice 8 7 is not a draw because it has a pair to go with it, right? Notice ace 6 essentially counts as a marginal made hand. You could bet this if you felt like it, though. That would make logical sense. Ace 8 is definitely a marginal made hand, though, because it's just a little bit better. And then, that's not all that many draws if you just think about it. Look, it's only 4 combinations of each of these, right? So that's 12 combinations of draws, and we have 42 combinations of premium made hands here. So we need to come up with a lot more draws. And we do that by taking the overcards with the backdoor flush draws, and also hands containing a 10 that don't have showdown value. You may say, why a 10? Because if a 6 or if an 8 comes, we have open-ended straight draw on the turn. If a jack comes, you see we have a straight draw as well. And that's kind of powerful. Also, the hands with a 10 all have overcards, right? So if you have king 10 and you get a king on the turn, you're pretty happy. So these are essentially like 6-out draws to overpair or to a pair better than top pair. Plus they have additional outs every once in a while when they get an 8. They can keep barreling. And sometimes even if they get like a jack on the turn, right? They have the extra outs too. And then we also have a few hands that are just like straight up overcards with backdoor flush draws, like king, queen of spades. If you take a look at ace, queen of spades and ace, jack of spades, these hands certainly could count as marginal made hands. They're somewhere in there. And then we have some junk. Our junk is going to be hands like just overcards without a whole lot of potential, like king, queen offsuit. If you bet king, queen offsuit and get called, you're almost always behind, and you have 6 outs to improve, but it's not a particularly great spot to be in. You'd much rather have additional backdoor straight draws, backdoor flush draws, etc. And then the low ace-x suited, these are just not very good hands. So this is the natural breakdown of this range, okay? Now, this is how I would, if I was sitting at the poker table thinking about how to categorize my range, this is what I would come up with if I just had to tell you what it looks like on the fly. However, whenever you're studying poker, you want to make sure that these percentages line up to those ratios we mentioned earlier. Let's go back over here. 33% to 67% draws, 70% to 30% marginal made hands to junk. What do we have here? Well, notice it's 17% to 22% premium made hands to draws, which is more than 50-50, more than 1-to-1, but it's nowhere near 1-to-2 because we can have up to 34% draws here, right? So we actually could use some more draws if we felt like it. What about our marginal made hands to junk? Well, this is almost not quite 70-30. We could really use either more marginal made hands or fewer junk hands. So an easy way to actually make this range just a little bit better and get closer to a somewhat GTO strategy would be to take some of the junk and move it to the draw category. So take a second and think about the logical hands you'd like to do that with. Well, I think Queen Jack and King Jack make a lot of sense. Notice here, if we took away 12 combinations of each of these, that would leave us with 24 combinations of junk. So then we have 100 to 24, which gives us whatever this is, 80-20 ratio, right? Which would be better because that would strengthen our checking range. And we would add 24 combinations to the draw category. That would make this number go up to about 80. Then we'd be looking at a 1-to-2 ratio. So by studying this scenario and thinking about it away from the table, we could play a better strategy than the way that most people would logically break this down if they spent even a little bit of time thinking about this. And that's going to make you play better poker. And the goal here is not to necessarily teach you the game theory optimal strategy, but to allow you to develop a strategy like this at the table, to where you are able to reasonably categorize these hands the vast majority of the time on the fly. And by the end of this course, you should be able to do that. I've taught many students to do it, mainly through the homework at pokercoaching.com. If you want a lot of extra practice, go check out that. And this is going to go a long way to helping you make the best decision you possibly can in the vast majority of scenarios at the poker table. And while there certainly are corner cases, this strategy is going to be pretty difficult to play against. It's not the perfect GTO strategy, but it is very, very strong. And I just want to show you here. This is what the actual game theory optimal strategy is here. This is using a program called PioSolver. And what this shows you here is we're betting 2/3 pot with 36.86% of hands. We're betting a third pot with 17.31% of hands, and we're checking with 46% of hands. And notice, a lot of these cells are multiple colors, right? Like, let's take a look at pocket kings here. This says you should bet bet 2/3 pot roughly half the time with it, bet a third pot roughly 25% of the time, and check roughly 25% of the time. Now, hate to break it to you, but it's going to be very, very difficult for any human, you, me, anybody else, to memorize these scenarios or to be able to come up with these scenarios on the fly and then be able to actually implement that strategy, because how do you know which 50% of the time this is or which 25% of the time this is, right? And for all I know, this is actually like 55%, 20%, 30% or something like that, to the point that this is not implementable at all. And that's why we've developed this strategy, because you just make all of these plays 100% of the time and you're going to be playing pretty close to well. However, you do want to look at the solver for essentially the ability to check your work to see if these ratios you come up with at the top are close enough. I'm not going to say they have to be exactly the same, but they need to be close enough. One thing worth mentioning whenever we do get to bet sizing is that I'm usually going to recommend just one bet size on the flop, because it's a whole lot easier to implement. And very often the solver will do something like recommending 2/3 pot, 45% of the time, a third pot like 5% of the time, and then checking 50%. And whenever the solver's not recommending using one particular bet size all that often, you can kind of ignore it. Remember, we're trying to play close enough to this where you can do it at the table in real time and not screw it up on a regular basis, which is what a lot of people do because they just end up guessing.
Now we're talking about basic situations with no real payout implications or what stage of the tournament this is in, what our position is in. We're talking about pure hand strength. So little things, when you get further down the line and you start seeing these things getting solved, you can say, okay, the kings is 50% of the time betting 2/3 pot. Cool, on this flop. But you could be in a situation where you're out of position, maybe you're on a final table or you're on the final table bubble, and there's payout implications and things like that. And you may know that you're up against a player who will only continue with the best hands. And when he continues, he will be raising. So you may elect to pot control in that scenario and just check and then get your value on turn and river, because again, you've kept his range wide when you only have one pair and you should be capped. So those are the little adjustments you can make based on the chart itself. The closer you know these, the better you're off you are. Honestly, it's only the ones for your premium made hands and your draws that really matter. Your junk is going to be fairly obvious and things like that, like these little shitty ones, that don't really have much going on for them. But it's just, those are where those little fringe elements come in.
Okay, so we can use the solver to essentially check our work. Let's take a look at some of these hands that very frequently like to bet, right? We have hands like Ace-9 that really likes to bet. Pocket Jacks really likes to bet. And then we have some hands like Queen Jack suited, Jack 10 suited, Queen 10 suited. These hands all like to bet a decent amount of the time, so you want to make sure you're betting some of these. Also notice stuff like King 10 is used as a bluff about half the time, which is relevant. So notice these hands bet sometimes. Ace High bets sometimes. Again, it's kind of difficult to make too many big assumptions out of this. But you're going to see that our strategy lines up decently well with this. And you also want to look at the solver to see patterns, right? Like notice here, top pair, top kicker bets more than top pair, bad kicker. Okay, so you should know this. For the most part, when you're betting top pairs, you want to be betting with the best top pairs more than the weaker top pairs, which we did here, right? And I want to make it clear, I made this before I even looked at the solver, right? This is just me studying that enough to know roughly what these patterns look like. Interestingly enough, though, take a look at pocket aces. Pocket aces actually checks like 60% of the time, whereas pocket 10s and jacks basically never check. Well, why would that be? The tough thing about using a solver is it actually doesn't tell you why it does anything. You have to figure that out yourself. But it makes some logical sense that pocket aces and pocket 10s are both very strong hands. But pocket aces is way less likely to get outdrawn on the turn if you let it go check-check than pocket 10s is. Because pocket 10s has to worry about any overcard, also at 9, 8, 7, 6, or 5. Whereas pocket aces really only has to worry about 9, 8, 7, 6, or 5. So that's why aces does check sometimes in this scenario. That said, the overpairs bet the vast majority of the time. And for simplicity, remember we're trying to make this simple, you might as well just bet with all of them. One outlier you'll see very clearly here is 9-8 suited bets basically every time. You're going to find that usually top pair with a gut shot straight draw often does end up betting, and 9-8 on this board is a gut shot straight draw. But we had a list over here to check because for simplicity, marginal made hand, we're checking with it. That said, if you bet with it, it's not that big of a deal. You can really go either way. But you want to use the solver to essentially...
At the levels I play, I tend to err on the side of aggression. So the 9-8 for me or any top pair gut shot is probably getting a bet from me if it's checked to me, or a c-bet if I happen to open it in late position or something.
Check your work to make sure these numbers are pretty close. And remember, over here, so the solver checks 45%. Notice we were initially checking 60%, but like I said, we would have edited this if we were categorizing the hands a little bit better. That would have moved some hands from our checking range up to our betting range, and we would have ended up with roughly the same percentage, which means we did pretty close to right. And it turns out if you can get the betting and checking frequencies of the solver pretty close to right, and you are making sure we are sticking with these ratios among our betting and checking range, then you're going to be playing pretty close to the solver. And it turns out it isn't actually all that difficult to learn to do this in the vast majority of spots. And once you learn how to do this, you're going to be well on your way to knowing when to bet and when to check in every scenario you encounter.
All right, let's do the quiz. What are the hand categories that are used to make decisions? Select all that apply. Premium made hands, draws, marginal made hands, and junk. Yeah, all of them. You have 10-9 suited on King of Hearts, 10 of Diamonds, Deuce of Spades. How would you classify your hand? I'm going to call it a marginal made. Yep. It's not premium, but, it's good enough. You have a marginal made hand. What are typically the two options you will take with your hand? You will bet you will check and call. Yeah. Two options you will take with your hand. Yeah, check and call. So you're going to check on the flop or you're going to call a bet. That's fine. Check, call your marginal made hands. You often want to play passively, checking when you're the aggressor and calling when you're the caller. Right, so if the guy raised pre-flop and you ended up in this scenario, you would be calling a bet. If you had raised pre-flop, you would be checking. And probably still calling a bet, depending on the other player's tendencies. When betting on the flop, what ratio do you typically want your premium hands to draw? Well, we want one premium hand to two draws. And again, this is my how often do people make a pair on the flop with an unpaired hand. This is just a shorthand. If you can remember anything, for very basic for statistics on people's hands, if you have two unpaired cards, you will make a pair about a third of the time on the flop. Remember that. So 2-1, premium to draws. What ratio of marginal made hands to junk will you typically want to have on the flop? 70-30. So this is in order to bet. So you're going to be betting your marginal maids, approximately 70% of the time, and having junk when you bet about 30% of the time. So this is your betting. What percentage of your betting range is made up of marginal maid hands and junk? 70-30. That's if you bet. If you decide to check, obviously you could be checking your marginal maid hands, or you could be checking all your junk. You know what I'm saying? So, what this is saying is when you bet, 70% of the time that you bet, you will have a marginal maid hand, and when you bet, 30% of the time you will have junk. See what I'm saying? So this is if you bet. We're going to mark this as complete. I'm going to see how long the next section is because today is a play day. Continuation betting is kind of a big topic, but you know what? It's a short section. Let's try to get through it.
Now let's discuss continuation betting. So a continuation bet, or a C-bet, is a post-flop bet made by the pre-flop raiser, the PFR, on the previous betting round. So you're going to find that the PFR, pre-flop raiser, is typically checked to. That's just generally what happens, and it's very often what should happen. So you raise pre-flop, our opponent calls in the big blind, they check the flop, now it's on me. Okay, we have to figure out when to continuation bet and how much should we continuation bet. So let's first discuss when you have a stack to pot ratio of 6 or more, which is usually going to be when you're about 40 big blinds deep or more in a heads-up single raised pot. And what I mean by that is, let's say we raise to 2 big blinds, the big blind calls, there's 5 big blinds in the pot, and we have about 37 left, 36 left, right? 36 divided by 5 or 6 or 7 is, 5 or 6 or 7. So when your 40 big blinds or deeper, this is typically when all of this we're about to discuss applies, and we're going to be discussing how to play shallower stacked a little while later. Okay, so 2 main factors here are our frequency, how often we're betting, and the size we are betting. And you're going to find that in general, the frequency is determined by the hand types, the range advantage, and position, and size is determined by the nut advantage, the range connectivity, and the stack depth. Okay? We're going to get to all of these. So first, let's discuss frequency, and then after that, we will discuss size. Okay. Remember, frequency is determined by hand types, range advantage, and position. So let's discuss range advantage first. The range advantage is the advantage that one player's range will likely have over his opponent's likely range on any individual board.
And that means based on you, like if you raise and you're in first position and the flop comes out ace 9-5, you have the range advantage. You know what I'm saying? You have the most common hands that are going to improve on this board versus your opponent who just called, let's say, in the cutoff. Now, they have the nut advantage, meaning they can have more sets than you. They can have more 2 pairs than you. If it's a flush board, they can have more flushes than you because of the way you define your range. You do have the nut advantage of having exactly pocket aces, but you're not going to see players betting all that in the flop, especially if it's like ace 7 deuce. They're not going to be betting that flop very hardly at all because they have all of the board, especially if it's a rainbow. So you have to consider when your actual hand beats your range. Like your range should be, all the aces, good aces, ace, king, ace, queen, the good pairs down to, all the way down to pocket 8s, you know what I'm saying? Things like that. Even down to pocket 6s, depending on how deep you are, coming out of first position. Whereas versus your opponent, especially if they're like in the big blind, then their nut advantage is through the roof because they can just have 2 pairs of every kind of combination calling one bet. Now, granted, they cannot have hands like pocket aces and kings. Theoretically, they definitely can't have things like ace king or ace king suited because of the fact that they did not 3-bet. They have not defined their range, and you'll find players will define their range. Now, that's an extreme example where the player in the big blind may be served well by just calling because it's so unlikely that they would have aces, but they are closing the action, so the pot is already heads up. But most players, and the correct thing to do most of the time is just to get more money in the pot when you have aces.
And on all boards, the pre-flop raiser will almost always have an absolute range advantage over the PFC, the pre-flop caller. So our betting frequency decisions are based on the degree of that advantage, how much of an advantage the preflop raiser has. So if the range advantage is small or non-existent, you're going to want to be betting way less often. But if the range advantage is large, you're going to want to be betting way more often. All right, so using Equilab, it's a free program. Go download it. Just Google Equilab. It'll come right up. You can precisely calculate range advantages based on your preflop range and your opponent's preflop range. So for example, let's calculate the preflop's raiser's advantage in position on ace of spades, 7 of clubs, 6 of diamonds. If you run the preflop raiser's range against the big blind caller's range, you'll see that the preflop raiser has about 65% equity, which is very, very large. That's a very high equity advantage.
Because his hand contains all the aces that would open. The opponent's range, this is a simple example, is not going to contain hands like ace, king, ace, queen, especially if they're like on the button, because they're going to 3-bet with those hands quite a bit.
And you're going to find that any like ace high board.
Now, if the player did, like, let's say you raised in the hijack and somebody, 3-bet you from the big blind, and then you called it, they now contain the range advantage in their hand, because if you had ace king, you would re-raise. You know what I'm saying? So it's the last raiser that kind of matters.
That's kind of uncoordinated is going to be very, very good for the preflop raiser, because if you think about it, the preflop raiser's range contains a whole lot of ace king, ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, right? Whereas the preflop caller's range often does not contain all of those hands. Like, notice right here, we have the preflop caller's range, pocket 10s to pocket 2s, right? That means they 3-bet aces, kings, queens, and jacks. Notice they don't have ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack suited, because they 3-bet them, right? So this is a scenario where preflop raiser has a huge range advantage. However, let's take a look at a different board. 7 of spades, 6 of spades, 5 of clubs. You see now, exact same range as preflop, but now the preflop range advantage is almost non-existent. It's 53-47, which for all practical purposes is no real range advantage. It's a little bit of a range advantage, but not one that you're just willing to bet because you're in such great shape. So in general, these numbers are kind of rough, but they usually line up. When you have more than a 50% equity range advantage, this is considered a strong advantage. And when you have a strong advantage, you're going to bet most of the time. Sometimes every single time. There are many spots where if you look at the game theory optimal solver, it says to bet with every single hand in your range, and that's because you just don't have very much junk in your range to begin with. Like, as a very easy example of this, let's think about ace, king, queen, right? On ace, king, queen, if you raised under the gun, that board is just going to completely hit your range to where you have a lot of top pairs, sets, straight draws, etc. You really don't have any junk or very little junk. Whereas if you think about the big blind caller's range, they have stuff like 9-7 offsuit on ace, king, queen, which is clearly terrible. So there you're going to have a huge range advantage. And when you have a huge range advantage, if you go back to the hand types, you basically have no junk and relatively few draws, which means you have marginal made hands and premium made hands. And when your range is pretty much entirely marginal made hands and premium made hands, you're very, very happy betting. Now, when you have between 54 and 58% equity, this is a moderate advantage, and you're going to want to be betting pretty frequently. And then when you have a less advantage, like on that 7-6-5 board, this is a weak advantage, and that's going to result in you betting less often. So, note about range advantage here. Equilab is the most accurate way to just determine your range advantage quickly and easily. And we are going to use typical board types to help you approximate these ranges coming up soon. That way you don't have to consistently go back and reference Equilab, because there are really only so many types of boards and no limit hold'em, and once you figure out how your hand or your range plays on those boards, you won't have to go back and consistently run this stuff. Because I know a lot of you may be thinking, how in the world am I supposed to remember all of this when I'm playing? And the answer is, you're going to study the common scenarios that come up, and once you understand the common scenarios, you're going to have a very clear idea of how to play in basically every scenario you're in. And we're going to get to that, though. Take it slow. Take your time. Don't rush ahead. We'll get there. Okay. So how does the range advantage relate to the hand types flowchart that we had in the previous section of this course? Well, range advantage is like a superpower that allows you to bet with more hands than only the premium made hands and the draws. So let's go down here to the bottom. With a weak advantage, like on 765, you're going to want to be betting less often, pretty much with only your premium hands and draw.
People talk about famous poker players that were way ahead of their time. I'm of the opinion, after going back and looking at the World Series back in '80 or things like that, I think players like Johnny Chan in '88 and Stu Unger in 1980, they were so dominant because I think even if they didn't articulate it as range, I think they understood things like the range advantage based on their position and the pre-flop actions. And that's why you would see Stu Unger betting the majority of the time. And that was the thing people said about him, was that he just was relentless. You know what I'm saying? He just never let people breathe. And I think, honestly, it was because he understood that as the pre-flop raiser, he had this supreme advantage. Now, back then, the pre-flop raiser usually didn't bet unless they got something. Like, they were the guy who, like, you would see scenarios back then. I mean, if you go back and look at, old games and things like that, where players would raise under the gun, the flop would come off, king, queen, 5, and they would sit there and you would see them check about 50% of the time because they would have completely whiffed the board. And you would see them check with hands as strong as ace, queen, which in today's math is just absolutely ludicrous. But guys like Stu Unger were opening that position and then raising with everything. They were opening junk, and they would be betting, all flops, that looked good for their range. And you would see it would work out weird where he would be opening in earlier positions with junk. And if the board missed, wasn't good for high cards, you would see him then betting for value because he now had junk in his hand and the board had hit. But when the big cards had hit, he would still smash the board, and his bets would just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and that was where he broke the game, basically. So it's important to understand these range advantages, because nowadays people do understand that this is what you're doing, but at the same time, they still don't know the counter punches. The counter punches are made pre-flop. You have to understand the player, and they're also made by, check raising your draws, things like that, and just taking away these plays. So it's just good to understand the importance of range advantage and how much control it gives you in every situation.
Draws. But if you have a little bit more of an advantage, you get to bet a little bit more often. You get to bet with your premium hands, some draws, and a few extra bluffs to some extent. Often they come from your marginal made hands or junk range, usually your junk. And then, when you have a strong advantage, you get to bet with nearly everything. Like I said, in those scenarios where you have a huge range advantage, you get to bet with all of your range sometimes. And that is what the Game Theory Optimal Solver tells you to do, and it is what you should do. So, when you have a big range advantage, you're going to be betting very frequently. And when you do not have a big range advantage, you're going to be betting less often, sometimes to the point that you're betting very close to 0%, which is a bizarre scenario, but we'll be discussing that and discussing the spots where you want to be checking very, very frequently. But in general, you're going to find that it's too hard to go wrong. Essentially always betting with your premium made hands and draws as the pre-flop raiser when checked to. And then sometimes, as your range advantage gets bigger and bigger, you're going to be betting with additional parts of your range.
Let's do the quiz. Which two hand types should you almost always continuation bet when in position? Select all that apply. Well, you're going to be betting with your premium made hands and your draws. Yeah. Because one for value, one for steals and, backdoors. Or steals and, semi-bluffs. As a player's range advantage goes up, they should c-bet more frequently. Well, very true. We can see as you have a strong range advantage, you're betting everything in your range. So yes, very true. If a greater than 58% range advantage is considered to be a strong range advantage, which types of hands should be c-betting when you have a strong range advantage? Select all that apply. Well, it is every hand. All of them. All of them. And you understand, he asked the same question twice there because it's super important. Your range is what's going to matter when thinking about when to c-bet, almost more than your position. I mean, your position's probably a very close second, but and that can mean having a positional disadvantage because it contains a stronger action. You raise under the gun, the flop comes, like you said, king, queen, jack. You now have a positional disadvantage, but because of where you raised, you have a huge range advantage. So you can just bet the world. I'll do it when I've seen that board happen and I've gotten called, usually in multi-way pots, because then when you bet, it's even a stronger move. I've done it with, pocket sevens or eights that I opened under the gun, got called twice by two players who don't exactly play tight. They kind of flop around, they kind of see whatever, but I can steal pots from them. Those to me are perfect situations to go bet, bet, bet right in their face. But you'll see most of the time they just fold on the flop or one guy sticks around, and then on the turn you just bet bigger and they just fold. Very rarely have I had to 3-bet those. Usually what's happening there is somebody has 2 pair and a draw. Or has a second pair and a draw. So they'll have like queen 10, or they'll have like jack 10 or something like that. Or even a hand as weak as, like a king 9, where they have something and it's kind of good, but they don't want to take that much heat. Well, then when that's the case, it's your job to bring the heat and just make sure that you don't let them breathe, just make them make all the bad decisions. It's literally that concept of not letting somebody breathe. I got that in my head years ago, playing live cash games shorthanded, because I realized that I was getting overwhelmed by how often these players were betting. And it really, I remember the session in particular, I was at Harrah's in the fishbowl back then, if you guys remember it. It was in, this glass room. And we were playing 6-handed, and I was doing well when we were 9-handed. But when we got down to like 6 and 5-handed in a cash game, and I just didn't want to leave, I found myself like really breathing and like being like, what the fuck is going on? Like it literally made my chest hurt. And I was like, it was like a weight, because these players were betting so often, and I didn't understand that my hands could be weaker and they became stronger because we were shorthanded. Sounds very basic now, but back then I wasn't that sophisticated. I knew how to play 9-handed, 100 big blind poker, and that was my bread and butter, and I literally paid my rent with it. So I remember we went on a break because they had to change dealers, and there was going to be a setup change, and they wanted to reset the table. So we all said, okay, well, we'll go take a break, go to the bathroom, and then come back and play. And they were giving us low rake because we were keeping a game going, and it was like noon on a Tuesday, and we were 5-handed. So I went to the bathroom and I was washing my hands, and I remembered hearing one of the guys. He was in the bathroom too, and he was talking on his phone, and he said something to the effect of, yeah, I keep getting one good card and raising, and it's working. And when he said that, I swear I felt the weight lift off my chest. I don't even know if he was talking about our game, but he was the guy who was doing almost as good as me, because I had knocked the players out who had left, and had like, I think I was sitting behind like, this is a 1-2 game. I think I had something like over 1,000. Like it was pretty deep, and he had like 700 or so. And after that happened, I was the last guy to return to the table because I was kind of walking slow and thinking, and I went, okay, I'm going to start playing and this was just my general way to compensate. I said, I'm going to start playing every king like it's an ace, and every queen like it's a king, and every jack like it's a jack 10 or king, or jack queen or king, and then everything else remained the same. So when I would look down, and I literally did it for every one of them, meaning if I had a 10 and a king in my hand, or a jack and a king in my hand, I played it like pocket kings. And if I saw the board hit and I had made a pair of like kings with a shitty kicker, I played it like, ace king. You know what I'm saying? So it was interesting, and it worked at the time, but it wasn't the right the right correction to make. Now I know the right correction to make, but at the time it worked, and I ended up making an extra $500. Then the game broke, and that was that. And it was just like this total switch flip that made me understand the difference in hand strengths shorthanded. And I didn't know it at the time, but it was all about range. My way of compensating was wrong, but it worked for the situation. I'm going to mark this as complete. The next section, position. That's a big topic, and it is a play day. We've gone about an hour, so I'm going to break this one up into 2 parts. So we'll finish the intro to the flop section tomorrow. And yeah, So I'm not going to host it. You guys can find somebody if you want to watch. I'm going to be back in a couple hours to play some tournaments, and I'll see you later. Thanks for coming out. Really appreciate you. See you in a bit.